Good afternoon, good morning. I'm not sure what time you're going to watch this video, but this is just kind of to recap a little bit of what we did last week, as well as take you into what we're going to learn this week. So let's start and let's recap with the last thing that we talked about last week, which is going to be the three states of the economy. Now, when we talk about the three states of the economy, it's very important that we talk about kind of what's happening here. So again, each of them where we had supply and demand, we were looking back in the first few chapters that we covered. We're going to look at the same thing, except now we're looking at rather than demand, we're looking at aggregate demand. And rather than supply, we're actually going to talk about not just short run aggregate supply, but long run aggregate supply. Now, to determine what state of the economy that we're in, we actually have to start with the long run aggregate supply. We have to remember what each axis is measuring. So if we're looking at each axis, we used to have quantity going here at this axis across the horizontal axis. Now we're going to have real GDP, because remember that is our output that our economy is producing. And so that's what we measure across the bottom, the horizontal border for each of these. And then no longer are we going to have price, but now we're going to measure inflation or deflation. So we call this price level. And I'm just going to put a PL on each one of them. Now, to start where we are, it's very important that we start looking at, let me rearrange this for just a second to get it where it's not, where you can see all three at one time. All right, so when we start thinking of it, the first thing we want to draw for each is going to be that long run aggregate supply curve. Remember, this is a vertical supply curve that's going to tell us what our economy could produce if we're using our maximum resources. We label this the long run aggregate supply. Now, at the long run aggregate supply curve, we are using all of our resources. So we produce something called the natural real GDP. Now, if we're using all of our resources, that includes labor, right? So the only kind of unemployment that we would have, I'm sorry, my dog is shaking in the background, is natural unemployment. Okay, so once we start looking at this, it's important. So where we are, according to this, tells us what the state of the economy is. So we're going to draw the three states of the economy that we can have. And the first is going to be a recessionary gap. That means we're probably too small, right? If we're looking at that. So recessionary gap is going to be the first one. The second one that we're going to draw is the long run equilibrium. And the third one that we're going to look at is something called the inflationary gap. And that means our economy is inflated. It's too big, right? So again, what I would like you to think about is X marks the spot. So if we come back, if we're too small, if we've recessed, our X, where we're currently producing, is probably somewhere over here. If we're inflated, we're too big. Our X is going to be somewhere over here, right? But if we're at long run equilibrium, all three curves cross the same point, right? And then you can just extend your lines. If I could draw a straight line, that would be great. So the upward sloping curve here is the short run aggregate supply curve. The downward sloping curve is your aggregate demand curve. Again, extend my lines. Short run aggregate supply curve is the upward sloping curve. The downward sloping curve is that aggregate demand curve. And again, extend and extend. So they cross the long run aggregate supply curve. Upward sloping is the short run aggregate supply curve. Downward sloping is going to be the aggregate demand curve. All right. So again, if we look at this, it's important to acknowledge that three things are occurring. Our economy is too big, an inflationary gap. Our economy is too small in the recessionary gap, but we're exactly where we want to be at the long run equilibrium. So we want to think about that as we go through our exercises for this week, because what happens is that we have to compare until it was two different solutions of why people believe where we were. So just remember that where the short run and the aggregate demand curve crosses our short run equilibrium, that tells us what we're currently producing, which we call real GDP, in the short run, given our current state of unemployment. Now, if we look, this is our real GDP line. So real GDP is going to be greater than the natural real GDP. And remember, unemployment and real GDP have an inverse relationship, to just reverse that sign. Okay. Now, what this means is we're producing more than we should be, right, in that inflationary gap. And our unemployment rate is going to be less than that natural unemployment rate of 5%, because that's where we want to be if we're fully employed. All right. And again, you can take where we are currently, and that would be our price level, our CPI where we are currently. Down the middle, we have our short run equilibrium here as well, but our natural real GDP rate is our real GDP rate. So our output is what we should be producing, and our unemployment is our natural unemployment. Now for the recessionary gap, again, where the two curves cross is your short run equilibrium, right? And then if you come straight down, right, that's going to tell us what we're currently producing, which is real GDP, which is going to be less than our natural real GDP. Unemployment, which is our regular unemployment rate, is actually going to be greater than our natural unemployment rate, which is going to be 5%. Now, what you need to think about as we look at these all together is that what we're going to start solving for next is that we're going to look at this right here. Because how do we get to long run equilibrium? How do we get to long run equilibrium, which is this space right here? So if we look, we want to calculate what that change in real GDP has to be to get us to long run equilibrium. Okay, what that change in real GDP has to be to get us to long run equilibrium here. Now here we're inflated, so our economy has to shrink, right? It has to get smaller. So there's two things that can occur. And so we could either move, and again, the first example I'm going to show you is by controlling a D curve. We can move the AD curve over, and that would cause a deflation in our economy. And we're going to look at that today as we go through our examples. Over here, we're going to solve for the change in real GDP by increasing the AD curve and moving it to the right. That means we're going to have significant inflation, right, as we go throughout it. But remember our equation, if we look at it, if we're solving for the change in real GDP, that change in real GDP equals the change in Signex, right? And you have to remember, Signex only affects the aggregate demand curve, right? It's only going to affect the aggregate demand curve. So if any part of consumption, investment, government spending, or exports goes up, aggregate demand goes up. And remember, that's the expenditure approach to calculating real GDP. And then you multiply that times the multiplier. Now we have to remember the calculation for the multiplier, and again, this is separate out to the side, is going to equal 1 over the MPS, right? Or you could use 1 over 1 minus the MPC for any of those. And we're going to work some problems at the end today that are going to deal with both of those. So our problem is that we've got to reduce the GDP if we're in an inflationary gap. So that's going to be negative number always. And if we're looking at increasing the GDP over here, that's going to be a positive number. And so there's two primary solutions that really came up with how do we get out of a recessionary gap? How do we stop an inflationary gap from overusing our resources? Some people will say, oh, I think that we should always have an inflationary gap. That means our unemployment is always going to be low. But that means we're overusing that resource. So we don't ever want to do that if possible. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to talk about the first method that really existed. It was the primary method. It's called the classical. So classical economists existed and still exist today. Up until really they were the primary, and it was the only type of economist that we had out there up until the 1930s. They've survived the longest, right? And there's a couple of things that you need to think about when we talk about classical economists that come to mind. The first thing is that they believe in something called Say's law. And Say's law says supply creates its own demand. And you're going to see this play into part today as we go through our examples. But I just want you to think about it first. The big thing about classical is they did not want any government involvement. They believe definitely that if we start thinking about it, that that the economy was going to solve itself. We didn't need anybody to intervene ever. So no government involvement at all. The economy would self-regulate, right? Now, in order for that to occur, there's a couple things you need to think about. That prices were free to move up or down, right? As were wages, right? Wages were very flexible. And again, I'm going to just put out beside it, flexible, upward and downward. Now, before I move any farther, I want you to think about your own job, right? If you're working for someone and they lower your salary, do you get the same production out of them? Probably not. But classical economists believe that you would, right? That was not even a discussion, that you definitely would get that. So we start thinking about supply creates its own demand, no government involvement, laissez-faire, right? Let it be. Don't get involved. Okay, and that's what classical economists believe. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the first thing we're going to do is we're going to draw a recessionary gap, and I'm going to show you what happens each step of the way for classical economists. At any point in time, if you need to pause this to complete your notes, please feel free to. All right, so let's draw that recessionary gap. Again, real GDP going along the horizontal axis, price level going across the vertical axis. You have a vertical curve, which is your long run aggregate supply curve. And that long run aggregate supply curve is going to tell you, can you remember what kind of GDP? Natural real GDP. And with natural real GDP, you have natural unemployment, right? Now, we're going to then be recessionary gap. So X marks the spot right over here. And I just extended my lines already so that this would be my short run aggregate supply curve. This is going to be my aggregate demand curve. Where the two curves cross is my short run equilibrium. And for that short run equilibrium, that's where my price level begins. And this is where my real GDP begins. So real GDP is less than my natural real GDP, and my unemployment rate is greater than my natural unemployment rate. Now, here's what happens. So step one for classical economists. The classical theorist. What they believed was that supply is going to create its own demand, right? So the first step has to be around supply. And again, supply creates its own demand is Say's law, right? So the first step we have to deal with is if supply is going to create it, something has to happen to supply. So remember down here, our unemployment rate is very high, right? If unemployment is high, right, that stands to be that there's a lot of people out there that want to work, right? So there's a lot of people that want to work, wages will drop. Even those that are getting wages currently, they'll accept less because there's so many workers out there. Wages are going to drop. When wages drop, that means that the short run aggregate supply curve will, wages are decreased. Can I produce more or less? I can produce more. So the short run aggregate supply curve will move to the right. And I'm just going to draw it in pink. All right. So we're not all the way there. So here's where we move to our short run equilibrium too, right? We didn't make it all the way to long run equilibrium. We're getting closer, but it's not quite there. All right. So the next thing you need to think about is supply is going to create its own demand. All right. So we had a lot of unemployment. So if wages drop, we hire more people, unemployment will fall down, right? Because we hired more people because wages dropped, right? And when we hired more people, unemployment dropped, people felt more confident. And now that they actually had some wage rather than none, consumption is going to go up. If consumption goes up, that means the aggregate demand curve is going to go up. And for the classical economists, they believe it would take us all the way to long run equilibrium. So that our short run equilibrium falls right at long run equilibrium. So again, the supply change, which is going to force and create its own demand, which is exactly what Say's law says. Now, in order for this to work, we have to remember that wages have to be flexible downward. And that's where the next theory actually came into play and said, maybe not, right? Maybe that's not what occurs. It's important to understand that there was a big differentiation that was occurring here. All right. I also like for you to acknowledge and look that if we look, our price level stays relatively the same. So if our price level is staying the same, that means we do not have inflation or deflation, right? So no inflation is occurring, which is what classical economists really want to think about. So step one for classical, that's supply, right? And if we're going to increase supply, it's because unemployment is going up. If unemployment is up, then if we have so many people unemployed, their unemployment rate is increased, then wages for everybody should fall. If that occurs, then the short aggregate supply curve will increase and move to the right. Remember, that moves us to SRE2. If I look, then unemployment is going to come down because we hire those people at cheaper rates. We can produce more. And if people are hired, then our consumer satisfaction goes up and our consumption, and we have more people working. So consumption actually will go up, which will cause the aggregate demand curve to go up, moving us all the way to long run equilibrium without inflation. So that's how the classical economists would solve a recessionary gap. And they would say, leave it alone, let it be, it's good, right? Don't change anything. But this just takes some time. All right, so let's look and see what happened during the Great Depression and why the next theory was actually evaluated and come up with. And it was by a man by the name of John Maynard Keynes. So again, we have to think about what's happening pre-1932, 1933. So we have real GDP, what our